Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for giving us another hour of your day and another day of your time. Without further ado, I want to bring on esteemed author and journalist Tarik Amar. I have to say, greetings, my friend. How are you doing today?
Hi Rashid, how are you doing? I
I'm
haven't
doing
seen you
pretty
for a
good.
long time.
Hey, it's snowing here in the panhandle. I'm talking about we're getting like 5 inches of snow here in the deep
Oh,
south in the United States. So
yeah, it's not snowing here. We are much luckier. I'm sitting on the Bosphorus, but you keep warm, keep warm.
I will. Hey, Tariq, let's talk about the situation. First of all, before we get into the Trump being inaugurated and becoming the president again, let's get into this situation with the Russian Ukrainian NATO dynamic. Because I know a lot of people have put their faith in Trump changing everything. And to me, that is like pie in the sky. Um, because there's such a well-oiled cog of a machine behind the scenes that continues to prevent any meaningful policy changes towards Russia, China, or the global South. Where do you think we're headed with the Ukrainian conflict, especially now because you have Trump in office and then you have the front lines collapsing everywhere?
Yeah, it's an extremely sorry, it's an extremely important question right now, and like you, a lot of people are asking it, and I myself too, and I don't know if anybody has like a convincing, conclusive answer at this point. I uh, I see your point. Your point is that there is such a structure established, especially in foreign policy in the United States. Call it the blob or the foreign policy deep state or whatever, or just a bureaucracy. That what the president wants ultimately is not really that relevant, right? They will finally somehow absorb that. Um, that's possible. It's possible that, in spite of everything he said during the campaign, um, he will make some moves about finding a compromise with Russia, but will not do so resolutely enough or will not offer the Russians a reasonable deal. And then it will go down and, not be talked about again, except the Russians will be blamed for it failing. That's one possibility. Now, I'm not sure we can predict that. And I'm telling you why, because I think you are totally right that there is a structure there that is unrelentingly aggressive, right, in terms of pursuing what they think are the national interests of the United States. But usually they're mistaken about those, but they're always very aggressive. But it could be that a part of these people have actually genuinely decided that while they want to be very aggressive, Russia isn't the right target, right? Not because they like peace, not because they want to be fairer, not because they want to actually build a good relationship, but because, most of all, they think that they have to concentrate their aggression on China.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are even still, I'm amazed by this, but they're still dreaming that they can somehow perhaps drive a wedge between Russia and China again, right? And so that play would be try to make a compromise with the Russians, settle that conflict, actually do change policy there, but then somehow also try to unglue the de facto alliance between Russia and China. Russia and China don't call it an alliance, but it is a de facto alliance. Um, those people might also be important. I personally think that we'll only know within maybe 3 to 6 months. At some point, then we'll be able to tell what Trump really wants and whether he actually matters and whether what he wants matters very much.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing with Trump is, I have to say, um, people shouldn't overestimate him personally, right? And I don't say this ironically or just to sort of tear him down, but he's also just not very good at a lot of things. And for instance, he thinks he is, I know, but he isn't actually. It's not true. And he's not good at understanding other countries and other cultures, not at all. And I don't mean this even in the sense of he's not sensitive. Of course he's not sensitive. He's incredibly proud of that, right? I mean it in the sense intellectually, he has a very weak grasp of who is actually dealing with on the other side. I think he has this intuitive respect for Putin. I think that's genuine. But today he tweeted something, he posted something on X that really made me wonder because it was so ill-conceived. It was basically this long post that says, we have to end this conflict, something has to happen, I respect Russia, I respect Putin personally, the Russians helped us win World War II, and because of all of this, I'm ready to do them a favor. That's the word he used, favor, right? And I'm basically telling them that we can wrap this up now, right? You can come to the table and wrap this up with me and have a deal, or everything will get much worse. And back he was to threatening them, once again, with sanctions and with tariffs. And my sense is that Trump has no idea how Russians react to something like that. And it's very easy to predict. They really don't like it to be talked to in this term, especially not from Americans. That is bringing out every fiber of resistance in their body politic. And if you don't believe me, I've just watched, actually, in the last half hour, their most popular political talk show. 60 Minutes. They also have a 60 Minutes, actually. And they were talking about this post forever, like for 20 minutes and more. And they were shredding it. And they were laughing at him saying that the Russians helped, so the Soviets, right? That they helped the US. Because the Russians know that in Europe, they won the war, right? If they want to be generous, they can say the Americans helped us win the war in Europe, right? Not Asia. That's a different story. So they were laughing about this, and not in a good way. Then they picked up on the word favor, and they translated it correctly into Russian as одолжение. And they were like, oh, yeah, really? You think you can do us a favor, right? Oh, let's see about that, right? So he just makes them wild that way for very understandable reasons. And if he goes into trying to now deal with Russia in this way, he's gonna get nowhere. They're fighting this war, right or wrong, because they've made up their mind. They're not going to take, I'm gonna say it, shit from the US anymore. And if he starts with the arm twisting, and if he starts with the public arm twisting, right, that's really bad. That's not a minor thing for them. Look, behind closed doors, right, politics can be hard. And if it came to negotiations and he brings his people and Putin brings his people, yeah, these people will have very strong exchanges, right? And they will set conditions to each other and they'll haggle. But you don't do this on a post. It actually matters. And that he did it shows me that he doesn't know where he is. And clearly he still hasn't got good advisors. He still hasn't got them.
So do you think, well, you and I have the same thought on him. He is superficial in his talking, and it seems like he's trying to correlate, more or less try to cool the more hot, the deeper hawks down a little bit with his rhetoric, but at the same time, he's alienating the very people he claims to want to negotiate with. So what can America bring to the table? This is what I'm saying, because we keep talking about negotiations. Everything that America and the entire Western military industrial complex has done has been met with failure against the Russians. And it is drawing them deeper and deeper into debt. And it is also opening up wounds and exposing the hollowness of all of these so-called modern weapons and the Western military doctrine, and showing the weapons and the doctrine to be inferior to Russian weapons and the Russian military doctrine. So Ukraine is losing. NATO is
Yes.
losing. The United States is losing. NATO is in debt. Europe is in debt. The United States is in debt. So what can America truly negotiate on when they have the losing hand at the card table?
Yeah, that is a key question, and you're right about everything you say. And I'd like to reinforce some of this. I'd go even farther. I would bet with you that the Russian political and military establishment, when they went for a much larger war at the beginning of 2022, right, when they rolled that dice, I would bet with you they did not know how strong they are. They did not yet know how resilient they are. They did not yet know how resilient the economy is. We have taught them this, actually, with our pressure, our arming of Ukraine, and our sanctions. We have shown them that they have much wider limits than they realized. They're much bigger again. And what you've said is also totally true. We've given them a crash course in destroying advanced NATO weapon systems. And they love learning. They really do. They did it to the Germans too. The Germans came in World War II, with the high engineering tanks, and the Russians, for a while they were impressed, and they were like, yeah, we know how to burn this thing down now. So this is not working. This is not how you deal with them. So the other question you asked, right? What does the US then have to bring to the table? Now, actually, it does have things. But to bring something to the table in these negotiations, to find a compromise with Moscow over Ukraine, right? They have to change their mindset. They have to stop thinking in terms of, we always want to negotiate from strength. Because what you have described is that they don't have strength there, and are not going to get it, right? Because the Russians are resisting too effectively. It's all relative. So they need to do what a lot of states have done in the past. It's not impossible. You negotiate with what you have. You can't always be superior and impose yourself. Sometimes you have to look at a fairly weak hand and think, what can I do with this that is still useful, right? And here's what they could do, and they're very specific things. The United States is not only a member of NATO, it's de facto the ruler of NATO, right? Every single NATO member can block the NATO perspective for Ukraine forever. Because essentially, if you are let into NATO, it's like a club. All other NATO members who are already in have to say yes. So if one single member in NATO says, it could be France, hypothetically, could be Britain, they'll never do this, I know. But one of them could say, we will never accept Ukrainian membership, and that would mean Ukrainian membership can't happen, right? This is actually the legal situation in NATO. But with the US, it's even more pronounced because the US is the boss on top of it. So if the United States under Trump went to Moscow and said, look, we have finally got the message. You're fighting this war because you will not accept a Ukrainian NATO membership, neither officially nor in an underhanded way, right? Just not. And we are ready to give you that. And it means not postponing, not open perspective. It means closing the door officially with signatures saying Ukraine doesn't get into NATO and will never do so ever. Now, there are people who, think they're friends of Ukraine. I call them the false friends of Ukraine, who've done enormous damage to them. When you tell them this, they get very angry. How dare you? Ukraine must have the option of getting into NATO. No, that's nonsense. Ukraine has suffered enormously for this stupid pipe dream. Ukraine is in a place on the map where it is much better to be neutral. That was the obvious policy. They had it for a while, and they should have clung to it. And this war would not have happened, actually, whatever propagandists like Tim Snyder are telling us. So they could say, absolutely no NATO. Here's something we give you, right? And the Russians are interested in that. They would take that. They could also say, Russia is the most sanctioned country ever in history, like literally, quantitatively. You can count out the sanctions. They beat even Iran, right? By a lot. So if the United States, again, they don't control all of this, but they control most of it, and they can influence everybody else. If the United States turned to Moscow and said, and we are going to retract the sanctions, maybe not all at once, but here's a plan how we are going to downbuild the sanctions. It's going to be over in a few years, right? That would interest the Russians. I can assure you that would be something they'd be interested in. So neutrality for Ukraine, an end to sanctions, and then, and this is something they will find very hard to accept, the Russians now insist that territories they have conquered in Ukraine, that they currently hold, will stay with them officially. And they want that acknowledged as well. In fact, they want acknowledged even a little more, right? These three things are things that if the West were ready to bring them into play, the Russians would listen. Maybe wouldn't end up with all of them. But as long as the West basically says, oh, no, none of these is ever going to happen, the Russians will not negotiate, they will keep fighting. And what Trump doesn't understand is he's in a really bad situation. Maybe he does understand, but he doesn't let on, right?
Right.
From what we see, he doesn't seem to understand that the Russians have the power to turn him into a second Johnson. You know how Johnson took over the Vietnam War and then got stuck, right? That's what they could do to him. Because if Trump goes in there and doesn't offer anything meaningful, and he knows very well, or at least his advisors should know what the Russians want, right? The Russians can say, look, no deal then, great deal maker, no deal. We continue the war. You can threaten us, you can shout at us, you can pump in more weapons. We'll do exactly the same stuff we did with all the weapons before to them. We'll shred them. And in the end, you will be stuck in a forever war, really, really badly, and you won't get out. And you know what? It's going to be Biden's war. You're going to be stuck in Biden's war. The irony, right? So it's not only that Trump gives this impression, especially in this tweet, that the Russians have to fear a lot if the war continues. That's not true. The ones who have to fear the worst and the most are the Ukrainians. And I'm not flippant about them. They've had a very raw deal here from everyone, including their so-called friends. And the ones who have to fear after them are the Europeans around them. And then it's actually the US. And after that, it's the Russians. Because right now, the Russians actually are holding a very strong hand.
So I think more pressure is on the United States because I think they're looking at the intelligence consensus that time is running out for the U.S. to be able to economically, industrially, and militarily compete with China. And I often say this: Israel, the United States, and the UK, they do these things whenever they're in a bind, or they're losing, or they find out the things that they're doing is not conducive to their overall strategy. They do this: they rest, they come up with some kind of excuse to rest, to rearm. After they rest, to rearm and then recalibrate. And I believe America is trying to do those things because of what is taking place in Ukraine, and she's slipping out of West Asia and North Africa. And they did a writing saying that the United States had between, I think, 12 months and 18 months to prevent China's rise. And I think we have either come to that, it was 12 to 18 months, I believe. And I think we've even come to that, or we have gone a little past that estimate with the United States. So I think what it is that they're not wanting to stop the war in Ukraine because of some benevolence or because they have some sympathy or empathy. I believe that their mind, they know that the greatest threat to their military power right now is the rise of China, because China has everything it takes to not only rival the United States, but unseat it. It is surpassing it in technology. With the flight of 2 6th-generation warplanes. It has a new engine that the United States said they would not have to 2035. It has the largest army, the largest navy, and now they said between this year and 2027, it would have the largest air force. I believe in purchasing power parity, China's economy eclipses the United States by roughly 5 to 10%. So all of these factors is causing the deep state to say, hey, we have to not stop the war, but maybe freeze it so that we can then try our best to prevent China's breakout capacity, because once China arrives, there's no suppressing it. Do you think that's playing in the back of these policy heads and in the Trump administration?
Yes, I think with some people, I'm trying to think of a specific example, and I'm blanking on his name now, which is really silly of me. He's actually Colby. First name I can't remember. He's the son of the CIA guy who actually ran the Phoenix program in Vietnam, right? Elbridge Colby. And he's an interesting guy. I mean, I think he's completely wrong, but he's interesting as a specimen because he has for years pushed this line. I mean, he is consistent, and his line is precisely the big challenge to us is China in Asia. And we should essentially, I'm paraphrasing, we should cut our losses in Europe, right? Let the Europeans do their own thing, including Ukraine. We leave that to them, which has a nice side effect of constantly ruining them, right? Keeps them down. And so then we can concentrate on the real challenger, who is China. And the problem with that logic is, I think it is, I can see where they're coming from, but I think they're completely wrong about the solution. Because there are a few things they don't understand. First of all, China is already unstoppable. I really mean this. There is no stopping China before it gets out. It's out, actually. You can't. The dynamic is there, right? The second thing is this idea that they somehow could concentrate on China while Russia would be at least neutralized. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's the Americans, it's US foreign policy that has taught Russia and China never to let go of each other. And Russia and China are both polities directed by ordinarily intelligent people, which I think the United States often is not. And I mean this literally. And so the Russians and the Chinese see this American game very well, and they have no reason to play along. Their response to any attempt, to take the pressure away from Russia, but to concentrate it on China, is that then Russia will play the role in a slightly different way that China has played for the last almost 3 years in this war in Ukraine, which is the big backup of Russia, right? They will never give up cooperating. And it's even more than that. It's not even just these two countries. What's emerging is sort of a whole set of countries that don't only cooperate politically and partly militarily, or actually all of them militarily in one way or the other, but that actually begin to weld the military-industrial complexes. And this is very important. And China is part of this, Russia is part of this, North Korea is part of this, and Iran is part of this, right? So the United States is not this whole idea that they can play divide and rule, right? We can split them up and we deal with one of them after the other. They can forget it. It's primitive. All the rivals see it. They won't run along with this type of thing, and it won't work. So, I think you're right, but it's a dead end for the people who think this way.
And Tarik, I often watch the news, different clips from the news in the Western world, and especially in the United States. Excuse me. And you can see that not only is the establishment out of touch with reality, but the mouthpiece or the media outlets are out of touch with reality. I'm going to play something for you, right? And it's crazy that they would react to Russia's threat. This happened a few months ago or whatever. But I want you to see the what's pervasive, the pervasive thinking that, it's okay for America to give Ukraine's weapons and to aim those weapons and to unofficially launch those weapons from Ukrainian territory into Russia. But if Russia dares respond or vows to respond, then not even on American soil, but in retaliation in Europe for a NATO attack, then that the United States, that's outrageous. It's an attack on us. I just want you to just look at the clip and tell me your thoughts, because when they say imperialistic minds, this is absolutely the case here. Just listen to this.
Hours after Russia launched a ballistic missile into Ukraine, the Kremlin threatened to attack a new American defense base in Poland with advanced weapons. Victoria Coates from the Heritage Foundation joins me now. Victoria, thanks for being with us. This would be, would it not, a direct attack on NATO?
Oh, good to be with you, Brian. Yes, this is deeply concerning. This is a new missile defense base on the Baltic Sea. The United States just opened. It's called Aegis Ashore. It's one of our most sophisticated missile defense systems. It protects not only Poland, but also our Baltic allies, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so, yes, this would be very much an attack on the United States, on NATO. And, you know, I have a very, very bad sense we're sort of drifting back into the Cold War here.
Okay, so I want to talk about that very bad sense for a second. I mean, you get saber rattling, you get rhetoric, and then you get things that could translate into action. How are you reading the rhetoric from Russia right now?
Well, this has really been an escalatory pattern for the last maybe week to 10 days since President Biden made the decision to give the long-range attack missiles, the ATACMS and the HIMARS, to Ukraine to attack in Russia proper. And obviously the Kremlin didn't like that. They lowered their threshold for using a tactical nuclear weapon. They fired off an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, at Ukraine, which was bizarre because those only exist to carry nuclear weapons, but this one had been modified to not carry a nuclear weapon. And now we have this. So clearly things are hotting up in Ukraine. And the problem is that the United States is in a state of transition from one president to another, and it's not entirely clear who's calling the shots.
Do our adversaries view the 2 months before President-elect Trump takes office, do they view that as a window to do exactly this sort of thing?
Yeah, transitions are always dangerous, Brian, but they can be ordered.
I know you're just chomping at the bit to say something. How is it that they can rationalize this and say that ever since Biden decided to give Ukraine weapons to attack inside of Russia, that Russia has been escalating ever since?
Well, there's so many layers. Look, I have to start at the beginning, right? First of all, what the Russians have said about this missile defense system in Poland that has been officially inaugurated, the Aegis Ashore system, which is a very old problem, but now it's sort of really bubbling up. And what they've said is, if you put this type of missile there, then that also is a target for us, which is actually standard military procedure, right? Mm-hmm. If you create a missile launch site, the Russians have basically said that site is a threat to us, and so it's now on our target list. Yeah, what did you expect? Gonna bring you flowers? And then what you also have to see about the system is, this is a very old story. It begins many years ago with the US saying, we need to station anti-missile defense missiles somewhere in Europe. And we need to do this allegedly to defend us and Europe somehow from potential Iranian and North Korean missiles. And there were all sorts of holes in the story, like why would they fly that way? And anyhow, so the Russians were actually even nice at that time. They were like, you know what? If that's your problem, right? So you're saying this is not about us. That's what you're saying. And the US was saying, no, it's not about you. No. It's on your border, but it's not about you. It's about those other guys over there. So the Russians come back and say, okay, it's not about us. You know what? Let's be partners. We build these missile defense systems together because after all, they're not about us, right? So then the United States, of course, went through a lot of very complicated moves because it had all been a shameless lie, right? And in the end, it turned out that they just put the missiles there. And now they're openly saying it's about Russia. And they were always about Russia. Now, the second point is that the Russians have always argued, and they're right about this, that the system has offensive capability. It takes a few tweaks, and you can not only defend, you can use it to shoot missiles at a target in another country, right? It's not a pure defensive system. That's how they always sell it. The Russians understand this, and they're like, you know what? I mean, we don't like this aspect. And so they built it anyhow, and they built it anyhow. Then, when the Americans gave the Ukrainians officially the permission, as they called it, to shoot American missiles into Russia, like into Russia itself, right? The Russians made two very important points, and many of them got lost in the West. The first one is, well, this is a problem in and of itself, because those are American missiles, you give them to them. So somehow you are really involved here, right? It's not just the Ukrainians. But the Russians also made another much more specific point, and nobody has ever proven them wrong. This is actually true. They have argued correctly that to shoot and target these missiles is impossible without direct help from people from the West, including Western satellite, Western targeting data, and so on. This is very well known. So when you fire a missile like this, say from somewhere in Ukraine into Bryansk Oblast, Bryansk region in Russia, it's not only an American missile fired by Ukrainians, it's an American missile fired most likely by British or American people on the ground, literally there, and using current American systems for locating and targeting, right? So that's a very common act. That's not just a permission. That's actually sort of a co-attack, right, on the Russians. So the Russians looked at this and said, well, look, if you literally begin to attack our own territory, we're in a very different place, right? And then they started to say, in other contexts as well, not only about this base in Poland, that means it's de facto an attack from NATO, not just from Ukraine, which is officially not in NATO. And if it's de facto an attack from NATO, we reserve the right. We don't want to necessarily do this, but we reserve the right to strike back at NATO. What that would mean, we don't know. It could mean Romania, it could mean Poland, it could mean Germany, it could mean Britain, for instance, right? In an extreme case, even more extreme case, it could mean the USA. And then when these ATACMS were used, the thing that the speaker on the American program called an intercontinental missile, it's not exactly that. It's a different type of missile. It's called an Oreshnik. It's whatever, it flies like 5,500 miles or something, and it's counted a little bit differently. And it's not only meant for nuclear warheads. And she should be really grateful the Russians didn't use it for nuclear warheads, by the way. And so they shot this at the city of Dnipro at a big sort of engineering works. And there are suspicions that maybe underneath there were big bunkers and they hid weapons depots and whatever. It seems that they didn't even use explosives. So they used the warheads of the rocket, but only with kinetic energy, right? Just by falling down and having all this energy, which was, pretty which was a serious impact. But if they had used explosives or nuclear weapons, of course, it would have been much, much, much worse. Now, in essence, the Russians made a very restrained decision. Because after they had said, look, if you shoot ATACMS at us together with the Ukrainians, we have the right to attack NATO, they still chose not to use that right. And that was correct. They shouldn't have. Instead, they struck back, but inside Ukraine. And while they struck back with a weapon they hadn't used before, that was a signal, right? We have a more powerful weapon we can bring into play here. They did it at a target that was not like civilian, or they didn't commit some sort of mass murder or anything. Quite the opposite. It was a very restrained strike, actually, right? So this whole caricature that you're getting in a show like this on American television, that the Russians are these wild, loose cannons, it's exactly the other way around. I'm very sorry, but they're the adults in the room. They're actually managing the crisis. They're actually keeping it sort of within a box,
And then she had the nerve to say, and the host was saying, and they were pushing a narrative that if Russia responds to the provocations, then it's a direct attack on NATO. And only in Bizarro World, do you get a take like so diverging from the reality of things. And this is what we see and hear, not just on mainstream media, but now it's taking place in so-called alternative discourse, which to me is not beneficial to the masses of the people who are yearning for proper and correct news. I think it's a disservice to those people. But I also want to play this for you. This is what a guy had to say about the people in the Pentagon.
It was another reminder of how, escalating this war that the Biden administration has now done very desperately, and I think completely pointlessly. And I think it's largely a vendetta that Trump has won the election, which has even been, some officials have said that in Reuters reporting that they're really just doing this because they know Trump is going to come in and negotiate. And I do have faith that Trump actually will negotiate based on the people who are now around him. I think they're desperate. I think they're trying to provoke an escalation from Putin so they can have an excuse to escalate even further. I mean, I know I've interacted with a lot of these people at the Pentagon from when I go to the press briefings there. And I've tried to talk to these people behind the scenes and get a sense of like, are you guys worried about the nuclear risk? I mean, it's an existential risk. It'll affect all of us. And to be honest, I think a lot of these guys are kind of psychotic. And even more dangerous, I think a lot of them are stupid. They really don't think of these risks. And so I think the worst thing that Putin could do right now, and this is what I would do if I were in his position. I hope he's listening. I would play it cool. I mean, you have the upper hand. You are months away from getting territorial concessions from a Trump administration. You can get Crimea and the Donbass, and then you can also get a photo op shaking hands with Trump. That will infuriate the Anthony Blinkens, the Victoria Nulands, the Hillary Clintons, who have tried to provoke this war for years. If they see that photo, their heads will explode. And then the real risk from that point will be these people are going to get together and try to assassinate Trump. And that's another risk that Trump needs to be careful of.
First of all, before you unpack that, even though he was making sense in a lot of what he was saying, he was, in so many words, even through all of that, they were saying that it would do Vladimir Putin some good to be seen shaking hands with Trump, or that's a favor from Trump. And what is crazy is when he said that you're about to get some concessions with the Donbass and Crimea. Russia already has the Crimea and the Donbass. So, I mean, what is your take on this situation?
Look, I have a lot of. I agree with you that this idea that Putin wants to be photographed shaking hands with Trump, if anything, that's icing on the cake for him. That's really not important. If there's somebody Putin really appreciates being seen with, if there's such a person, that's Xi Jinping, literally, and vice versa. It's not an American president anymore. That's over. Those are illusions. But, it wouldn't do harm. So, but I have a lot of sympathy for the other points he was making. In fact, at the time, I was thinking not so dissimilarly, because look at it from Moscow's perspective, right? Trump wins the election at the very beginning of November, and he promises to come to terms. Sometime after the 20th of January, he says, like in basically November, December, sort of 3 months, I will make a deal with you. And maybe it's not going to be the worst deal for you Russians, right? That's what he says at the time. So I think this journalist was right about one thing, absolutely right, that the Biden people were trying to provoke the Russians into an overreaction, right? So that the war would escalate before that can happen. Right. And that goes back to what we were talking about, why it was so important that the Russians kept their cool. And even if they responded to an American provocation, they actually did it in a very restrained way. And that was part of the background to that. They didn't fall for the provocation. Right. You want us to attack an air base in Germany? No, you're going to strike a place somewhere in eastern Ukraine. It stays within the theater, so to speak. Right. So I think there he was right. I think where he is a bit too optimistic or where it's a bit too simple is where he assumes that the Russians simply believe that Trump will deliver. I don't think they have ever done that. And I'm not just guessing. I follow like what they say. I follow Lavrov. I follow what's being said on talk shows. I think the Russian attitude has been between November and now has been much more like, look, what do we have to lose? Clearly, the Biden people are desperate and they're trying to provoke us. Let's not fall for that. Why would we do them the favor, right? We will wait. We will wait because we don't know if Trump is perhaps going to deliver. And if it turns out he's not delivering, he doesn't want a serious deal and compromise with us. If we figure that out by, say, April, well, we'll still be around, not much lost. So I do think that the Russians were restraining themselves and waiting for Trump to see what he will actually do. And I think now we are in precisely that moment where Trump has to show what he really means to do. And if they find out that he was lying, then they will register that very, very quickly. And if they find out that he is interested in a real serious negotiation, they will understand that as well very quickly. But now he has to actually show his hand, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of things get lost on Trump's first administration, because remember, it was his administration that upped the funding for the training of Ukrainians to fight against Russia, and they upped the weapons, the pre-war weapons depot when they were shipping huge amounts of weapons to Ukraine. So with that, why does that get left out of the Western media, and why does that get left out of the and I'm not anti-Trump or pro-Trump. Why does that get left out of the pro-Trumps talking about how Trump can make a deal with Russia? Don't you think that Russia is very aware that it was under his administration that the funding for the training of the neo-Nazis was upped, and the shipment of more advanced weapons was upped under that? Why do you think
the CIA was getting much more active too? Yeah, that's all true. Look, no, the Russians are aware of all of this. That they still have a proper foreign service. They have, unsurprisingly, intelligence services that sometimes fail. Right? They do fail. I can give you examples, but on the whole, they work pretty well. They have a very serious government, the Russians, actually, whatever you think about their policies, but governing, foreign policy included, is a very serious business from them. They're systematic, they're smart, and so on. So they know all of this, and they remember everything, believe me. But think about it like this, right? From their perspective, they can look back and say, okay, that's what he did then. Bad enough, but frankly, that's what the Americans have always done to us at every opportunity, right? It's just another variant of Americans trying to, meddle with us as good as they can. On the other hand, that was then, before we actually won the war. Now, several years later, we are winning the war. And so for the Russians, the decisive questions, because they're rational, they're not vindictive, they're not hyper-emotional, the decisive question probably is not, what did Trump do in the first term? It's, where is he now? Has he learned the lesson? Is he ready to accept that they cannot defeat us and that we are actually about to defeat them? And is he ready to negotiate in this situation instead of trying again and again and again to reshape it, right? That's, I think, the key question they're asking themselves. The stuff that he was sending them, the famous American anti-tank weapons, now forgetting their name, everything you mentioned, Russia is a great power. They can look back at that and say, yeah, it happens. It sounds cynical, but, that's the past now. So now focused on what happens next, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, excuse me. Rest, rearm, and recalibrate. Those are the 3 R's of the empire. And I believe that desperation is starting to set in the American power structure, because they see China outlapping them in everything. So it would behoove them to strike a deal with Russia more so than it would for Russia to strike a deal with the West, because they need to focus all of their energy, all of their resources, and all of their economic prowess to try, in their mind, to pin down a rising dragon and to prevent it from ascending to the top power and the top economic power, even though we know they're already there. But perception is everything in this world. So so wouldn't it do you think that is another reason why Trump is so adamant about trying to pause the conflict or bring it to a heel, not pretty much stop it, maybe let a little bit fester so he can double back, or the United States can double back, because they see China as the preeminent threat, because it is a non-white, non-Western nation, and it has the economic, political, and technological prowess to not only catch up with America, but surpass it?
Yeah, I think there is that is a real possibility that is one strategic option that's very powerful right now with Trump and with people around him. But and then you have to ask yourself a second question, I think, which is if they're trying to pull this off, right? This sort of as you call it, recalibrating, right? We retreat from one failed war, right? Once again, we failed. We have a failed war venture. We retreat from that. We get out from that. We restock. We rest, right? We reassign our resources. Here's the thing. Apart from the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are now in an alliance, I mean, Putin and Xi Jinping have just talked to each other online yesterday or the day before yesterday, and it was big news, at least in Russia, right? It was a very serious online meeting. They are making it clear they're there to stick together, right? So apart from that fact, there is something else, which is the Russians have told us, they tell us this again and again. It just doesn't get reported in the West. They're so explicit, actually. It's nothing that complicated. They're telling us we are not interested in just a pause. We don't want just a pause. And if you're trying to get us there to some sort of ceasefire forever, just a pause, everything can restart, we are not taking the bait. The Russians, Putin has said it, Foreign Minister Lavrov has said it, the people in the Russian Duma have said, everybody is telling us what we want is a full settlement. And that means it's got to be solid and it's got to be built to last. We don't want a pause. We won't give you a pause. We won't give you that option. And so this is very, very intriguing because it basically also means that they're saying to the West, to the Europeans and to the USA mostly, you need to find a way to get it across to you Ukrainian clients that there is no restarting. If we stop, we only stop if this is going to be solid. And if we don't get a solid solution in our favor, that's what they're demanding now because they're winning, we will not stop. And there you are again, right? And what I often miss with American foreign policy discussions is somebody once said, American foreign policy is like all these Americans have to agree with each other. And that's the only thing it takes. Then the problem is solved, right? All these people in Washington. And in foreign policy, you need to agree with the other guys. That's your main task, right? And they're not even seeing it. They're not even seeing how far all of these little things like a postponement and a Korean solution and a permanent ceasefire, the Russians have told them multiple times, this is not what we want and we won't go for it. They don't even have to start. So again, will at some point the Trump administration really change that approach? Then there's a chance that they can have a compromise, or will they not? There's one other question that's important, right? Putin and Trump say they want to meet, right? It's on and off, but I think there will be a meeting reasonably soon. What are they going to say about NATO? Is Trump going to say to Putin essentially, you know what? Don't worry so much about NATO. I don't like it either. And actually, we are going to leave. Or if we don't leave, we will at least not finance it anymore, which is what he's telling the Europeans, right? He's now telling them they need to invest 5% of their gross domestic product every year into their militaries. That's humongous. That's a crippling demand, right? So that's a demand you make to either make it unfulfillable, so then you can break things, or you really want to sort of ruin people, which is what the Americans have been doing to the Europeans for a while. So who knows? But here's the thing. If the Russians were going to get the impression, the reliable impression, that NATO is actually going to lose its oomph, it's not that powerful anyhow, but that it's actually going to get much weaker again, that also would reassure them, because that's really the one thing that, is a serious security consideration apart from the USA as such, right? So it's very, very complicated. When the war started, the big war, I don't know if you remember, it started in February 2022, the big one. And at the end of 2021, the Russians sent essentially 2 documents to the West.
Yes.
And one was saying, this is what we want to talk about with the US, and this is what we want to talk about with NATO. And they were meant as drafts, right? In Western media, they claimed this was an ultimatum. That's not true. The Russians were talking very tough, but it was clearly still negotiable, right? But the core of these documents, the idea was, we need a big reset. It's not just the Ukrainian thing, right? We need to talk about the whole security situation in Eurasia, or in northwestern Eurasia, if you want, right? Like in Europe and Russian Europe and so on. And so one thing the Russians could do if Trump comes in to negotiate, if he really does it, is to revert to that idea and say, look, this is not just about Ukraine. We have to settle this whole problem that came out of your long-standing policy of pushing NATO against us and expanding. We need a total reset, right? Could the Americans ever say yes to that? I don't know. One thing is certain, the Europeans won't decide anything anymore. The irony of the Europeans is they have now for years obeyed the Americans as never before, not even during the Cold War. That's the weird thing. The Cold War was over, and then they really started submitting. Right? They have obeyed them to the point of suiciding their economies. I'm not kidding you, right? That's what they've done, and destabilizing their polities. It's really strange. And if Trump and Putin and if the US and Russia should come to some form of grand bargain, if they will leave out the Ukrainians, that's for sure, they won't have a say, and they will totally leave out the Europeans too. This is why you already get the French foreign minister going on TV like 3 days ago and saying, any agreement between the Russians and the US, we have to play a role too, because they're realizing they won't be asked, right? That's what they get for their obedience.
Well, I'm here in the bowels of the beast, and this is something that I've learned. America will never, and I repeat, will never honor any agreement, especially when it comes to her position globally. If she thinks that it will take some political capital from her, if it will push her back a little bit geopolitically or economically, she will never go for it. She can promise you anything.
Yeah.
She will never live up to it. And if any deal that she comes with Russia and she's talking about, okay, we'll weaken NATO, I would not believe that, because NATO is the military vehicle which America drives to dominate the world, so that she is not over extended in such a grandiose way or something like that. And all I could say is just point to a international treaty, point towards any agreement that America has signed with anybody and honored it. And then maybe I'll start believing that America would honor the agreement that she signs with Russia. I can't. Go ahead.
But here's the thing, Rashid. You know what's interesting about what you've just pointed out, and I think you're right. The Russians know this. They talk. That's another thing. I watch their TV all the time. I read their newspapers. They talk about this all the time. The Russians themselves. This is a main discussion point among them. Again and again, they're talking amongst each other about the fact that America is so incredibly unreliable. And they're talking about exactly this question. How do you even make a deal with people like that? Right? There is a Russian word for that they're using, but it's недоговороспособный. And it's a long word that means agreement incapable. It's a word that expresses agreement incapable. It means that you are so unreliable that there is no making agreements with you. And this has been used, for instance, by the Russian foreign minister about the West, and by Putin too. There is a huge consensus in the Russian elite, and I dare say in society too, that the West and the US in particular have this quality that you just can't believe a word, and even when they sign it, it still doesn't matter. And what they do when they see presidents changed, right? They had a lot of reporting on the inauguration, right? And they had a lot of fun with it too. So when they see that, they look at this whole ritual where one president uses a number of these executive orders to kill the executive orders of his predecessor, right? And then they see that Trump actually kills a Biden order that actually killed a former Trump order, right? The Russians see all of this and they're laughing on TV and they're like, what sort of political civilization is that? Everything restarts with every president, right? You can make an agreement. Panama can have an agreement with President Carter, right, who gives them the canal as he should have, and then Trump comes in and says, no, I don't see it like that. Nothing is binding on me. I'm in the same job, I represent the same country, but no, I'm different, right? The Russians see all of this. The thing that you've described, they see it very well. And if you are saying that this is another big obstacle to actually coming to a compromise, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That is a huge obstacle.
And also, this is something that should be thought about by the Russians and everyone else. America is not only agreement incapable, but they can never see themselves on an equal footing with anyone else. It must be my way or the highway. I must have some type of advantage over you. I must dominate. You must take my dictates. We can negotiate, but I must have the upper hand at all times, and I must have the advantage. And when you are doing that, especially as you become weaker, your global order is in disarray and collapsing, you have to, there comes a wake-up moment in your life where you have to admit to the reality or the collapse. And I believe rather than acknowledge the collapse, they will continue to go with folly, which will bring down the empire.
Yeah, I don't know what to say, because I think you're probably right. I share you if pessimism is the right word. I feel that the weird thing to me is that there are several ways. If I look from outside at American media, American movie making, even American novels, American graphic novels, there is a very strong awareness that something is very wrong, that there is a decline going on, that things are falling apart, that there's a great danger in the future. That seems to be there, right? Right now, it's all dampened out, and there's this moment of euphoria, and Trump says, the golden age is beginning, or whatever, all that nonsense. But the background noise of the last 2 decades almost in America, or maybe a decade, has been great fear of a coming decline, of something even apocalyptic happening, a civil war, whatever, right? And so people are aware something is very, very wrong at a deep level. But what is so strange is that it seems extremely difficult to really focus on America domestically. So instead, you get all of these ersatz actions. And in some way, Trumpist foreign policy is this huge ersatz action, right? Our schools are rotting away because we won't finance them, right? Our cities have enormous problems. Our infrastructure is degraded. Large numbers of people live from paycheck to paycheck, if from paycheck to paycheck, right? We have big homelessness populations. And so you go through it. America is in really a lot of crisis. And the response is, we want Greenland. No, but it's empires have done this before, right? Instead of focusing inward, which they would need to do, they would have to repair themselves, which is a very hard process. They believe that you can solve these problems with more aggression outside, more plunder, more exploitation. And Trump says it very openly. He says things like, I'm going to have this external revenue service. We're going to all this money from all these foreigners. They're going to bring us money. We're going to plunder more. That's essentially what he's saying. It's like a late Roman emperor, It's all falling apart in good old Rome, but we can go out and get some more tribute. So this is not going to work. This is not going to work. And the last time, and I was wrong, by the way, I was wrong. The last time I felt there was an option that somebody had at least an instinct to address America's many crises from within was when Bernie Sanders was running for the first time. Now, Bernie Sanders, of course, has become an enormous disappointment. Don't get me wrong, I hate Bernie Sanders by now. So, but just to give you an image of that was the last time I felt like, yeah, maybe they can take a turn and, they can fix themselves and that there can be sort of a real renewal from within. That's not happening. It's not happening.
And, in closing, just give me about 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to say, if we look at America, there's no way that she accepts coming to the table on an equal playing field. Yeah. Why do you think the war is taking place in Ukraine? It's because the American foreign policy says not to allow any nation or combination of nations or any re-emerging power to come to be able to rival the United States. Look at the chaos in Africa, North Africa. Look at the chaos in Latin America. Look at the chaos in West Asia. Look at the chaos in Europe, and look at the chaos through the Asian pivot that is starting to bubble up in Asia because of American policies. All of these policies are not meant for national security. They're not meant for the benefit of the people of America or the people globally. What they're meant for is to contain any growth outside of American and British dictates with other world. And this means that they are incapable of actually looking at you or I in an equal manner. So they're incapable of actually signing an agreement with Russia or China on an equal basis. It's an impossibility because they still believe that everything is run through London and DC.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is that old problem, right? That United States, the bedrock of United States foreign policy since at least the end of World War II, has not been to say, we want to be among the strongest countries in the world, right? If there are like 6 or 5 really big countries, we have to be one of them, right? That's not American foreign policy. As you rightly say, American foreign policy has been, we have to be the single strongest one, the single strongest one. And one aspect of this is that American foreign policy has also not been to say, we want to control our own country, and like many other countries, we want to have, or big countries, we want to have a sphere of influence around us. That's not nice. Ask the people in South America, right? To be caught in the sphere of influence of the United States. That's not nice. I'm not saying that's idyllic. But the United States is even worse, because the United States is a strange case of a country saying our sphere of influence is literally the whole world. So what they're incapable of is they are so asocial as a state, right? That they are incapable of even saying, which is not a lot, look, we want to be among the big boys, but we accept that the Russians are big and the Chinese are big, and who knows, somebody else is big. Maybe Brazil is going to be big one day. And those guys we respect, and we have a balance of power with these players, right? We don't want to be second place to them, to any of them. We want to be equals, but we accept that we can't be higher than them, right? The United States isn't even capable of that. That's how pathological its position has become. It's got to be number one exclusively, right? And that's exactly what the Russians hate. They understand this completely. And what the Russians and the Chinese have always said is not, we want your place. A lot of people misunderstand that. They think the Chinese want to become like America. No, they're not insane. The Chinese are much more traditional. They're a big country that wants to have control around itself. That's true. And if you're their neighbor, that can be very unpleasant. But it is a policy that in the end is more peaceful than a power that says, I want to control everything everywhere, right? Because you can still deal with powers like this. In other words, China is looking for, if it's looking for hegemony, it's looking for regional hegemony in its area. If Russia is looking for a sphere of influence, and it is, it's looking for a regional sphere of influence because it thinks it needs them. That's very traditional. And they're probably right. The US, again, says our sphere of influence is everywhere. So they clash with everyone, right? And exactly as you said, it's not only that they can't accept that anybody overtakes them at the top, they can't even accept that there are more or less independent power centers anywhere. They all have to be stomped out immediately, right? And the strange thing about the Ukraine war, to get back to your initial question, is if you look at it, even from this perverse logic of we have to keep our power, it was completely unnecessary. Like, what would have happened if the United States had not armed Ukraine? What would have happened if the United States had not, since 2006, 9, now I forget the exact year, Bucharest summit, 2008, said to the Ukrainians, you will be in NATO? Nothing. The United States wouldn't have lost a thing. So the Ukraine war, if you look at it from the American policy side, is particularly perverse. Because on the Russian side, yes, they invaded their neighbors and that's bad. But historically speaking, they were threatened in their immediate environment. I'm not justifying it, but a lot of countries have fought in these situations, a lot of them. The United States, as many people have pointed out, would fight if the Chinese tried to do something in Mexico. Very much, absolutely. So what the Russians have done is not unusual. It may be bad, but it's not unusual. What the United States has done is actually very unusual, namely saying, we're gonna come up right here to your doorstep and challenge you just because we feel like it. No, I'm seriously.
It's absolutely crazy. I know you have another podcast to be on. I want to thank you so much, Tarik, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And do you have any parting words for the audience?
That's a good question. Well, I should thank them. For those who have, been listening to us, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'll send you the video in a few minutes. Hey,
and thank you too, by the way.
Thank you. Be blessed and be safe. And I'll send you the video in a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Everybody, thank each and every one of you for joining us on the most powerful platform for truth on God's green earth. This is your platform for education, elevation, and edification. This is the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, your friend, and your brother Rashid. Always remember as we go out to do right by others, not because there's some material gain in it or some accolades to be given. Do right because it's the right thing and the humane thing to do, because even when no one else is watching, know that God Almighty is watching, and that's the main one that you should be trying to please and get your accolades and blessings from, okay? If you love truth, know that I love you with all of my heart, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. Before I say something to my mom, there will be no outros until we have settled this copyright thing with YouTube, okay? We're trying to come up with something new. But hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. And everybody else, if you love truth, I love you too. Peace. We're out of here. Thank you so much.